Hello there. Welcome to History in Lowell. I'm Maritza Grooms, and I'm here with my personal professor, my buddy, Bob Forrant, who has graciously bestowed so much of his wisdom and knowledge upon me and all of us. Thank you, Bob.
We thought many months and years ago, actually, that we were going to do one. And here we are, that many months, and I think probably around 30 shows later. So
Right.
we got to be one of the longest running programs in show business at this point.
We gotta be. Yeah, we've been talking about so many things. The last few episodes have been quite compelling. Just talking about racism as a public health crisis, the voting rights, and the lawsuit against Lowell, and all of these things. And I think that we're going to tie it all in today with a lot of what's currently going on, but also our history, the city's history, and America's as a whole, right? Because I mean, I feel like Lowell is that microcosm of the nation.
Yeah,
we very
6 degrees
clearly,
of separation. If it happens somewhere else in America, there's a connection to Lowell somehow.
for
Absolutely.
certain.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sure.
So maybe we should start with today. We know that today in 1963, there was a huge, big event, and this event is currently happening in DC right now, the March on Washington. So, Bob, take us back. Let us know what's going on.
So the march on Washington happened in 1963. This day in 1963, and most people that know a little something about it know it was when Martin Luther King gave his "I Have a Dream" speech. But what's not known, I think, is that it was called a March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. That it connected civil rights, but it connected it in a way to the economy, to jobs, to the lack of economic progress as Black Americans were kept out of the better paying jobs in the job market, deprived of educational access so that they could assume technical jobs and things like that were happening in the economy. And so it was really, as much as it was about the "I Have a Dream" speech that Martin Luther King gave as a young man, John Lewis also spoke, an even younger man. John Lewis spoke at that, but it was organized largely by different people than we know in history. But one of them was A. Philip Randolph, who had gotten his start organizing railroad workers in the 19-teens and 1920s. And was instrumental in a planned march on Washington in the 1940s to force Franklin Roosevelt to desegregate defense jobs during the Second World War. And so there was a real focus in the speakers and in everything that happened that really looked at the economy, and the argument being made that, look, it's not good enough to basically say we can have some modicum of civil rights, although obviously that I'm not denigrating that, that's important. But without economic opportunity and economic freedom and economic mobility, it falls short of the mark in terms of what we're talking about. So that was a really important moment. Unfortunately, again, the way history gets taught, and the way, if you get it in junior high or high school or middle school, whatever they call it these days, you usually get to watch like an excerpt from the "I Have a Dream" speech, which there's nothing wrong with watching, but that's what it's reduced to. And it also then, by doing that, it fails to realize and recognize in the way teachers teach it, that it was the culmination of this whole series of events throughout the 1950s, from Brown v. Board of Education to ordering separate but equal as unconstitutional. Schools need to be desegregated, lunch counter sit-ins, Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. There's a whole history here that culminates with this big event. And sometimes, again, we fail as historians, as teachers, as humans, we just think of history as these extraordinary one-off gigantic events. Mm-hmm. And we fail to understand the history, the slow build, the movement. You don't get 250 or 300,000 people in Washington, D.C. on this day in 1963 just because, okay, everybody, let's just come. There's been a series of events, actions, reactions, right? And that's what, it aggravates me when I teach it, when I get students in front of me at the university and we talk about this and what, you know, and I'll say, well, what do you know? And they know this little tiny wormhole
Yeah,
of the bigger story. And that's problematic for me, obviously. You can see
obviously.
I'm already worked up here.
Oh, I love when Bob is worked up though, because that means that this is going to be even better. We're going to get some really good information.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot. So
Yeah, well, like you said, it's all connected, and people think that these big movements, these strikes, these boycotts, these what are reduced to riots happen just out of nowhere overnight because, oh, well, now a whole group of people are mad. But that, to me, that just, for me, it infuriates me because it's like, wow, you are incredibly privileged to not have to know all of the smaller steps that it took to get to these bigger
right.
movements and bigger events. And none of them come without all of this good trouble, right? None of the good trouble comes without sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
And there's incredible sacrifice that all of these folks have made to get us to where we are now, and for us to even be able to speak about it, and me as like a community advocate and community organizer, for me to continue to do that kind of work. So it
Yeah, I
is
mean,
infuriating.
yeah, no, I mean, I think that we have to know that without knowing the history, it becomes much more problematic, and I think people can become much more pessimistic and sort of feel like, you know, there's no hope or all hope is lost or whatever phraseology people want to use. And then when you realize you're standing on the shoulders of these incredible women and men who organized for decades and generations, you're in, you know, you're in the continuum, and that should actually make us feel better that we're doing righteous work, right? That we're looking at the history and we're fitting ourselves into this, you know, I mean, not that I'm saying I'm like any of those people we've been talking about, but that when you advocate and when you do this work, you're not alone, right? And I think sometimes we feel that way. And for me, the history is, even though again it's infuriating and it gets me all agitated, it's helpful in a way. It for me, at least in some way, it's calming because when I think about it, it helps me know I'm not crazy, right? That advocating for what we've been talking about on these programs, all these many months and whatnot, we're not wrong. Right? And sometimes you can get the feeling like, well, maybe I'm crazy.
Yes.
Yeah, no, we're not.
No, we're not. And neither were, you know, all of the, I think all the time, and you know how I think, because we have our own personal conversations outside of this show. I get awesome homework, guys. I just want everybody to know that. I haven't been able to read the articles right now, but I will. I've had a busy week. But I think of, you know, James Baldwin. I think of, you know, Martin Luther King. I think of Malcolm X. What would they be saying now about how things are now? You know,
Mm-hmm.
would they think, wow, look at all of these efforts that we've made, and, you know, to see these things come to fruition? Or would they still be like Angela Davis, who is still out there at protests, you know, fighting
Yep.
with us? You know, what would that look like now? And what would the great James Baldwin have to say about this? Like, I really like. I
Mm-hmm.
bet he would be able to articulate that. I mean, I feel like he talked about it. I feel like he talked about this moment in time in some of his interviews. When I listen to him now, I'm like, wow, it's almost as though he was prophetic, and he knew what was going to come out of the 60s and that
Yep.
generation, you know.
Yeah, and I think again in that context of people, you have people like Fannie Lou Hamer, who in 1964 is trying to integrate the Democratic Party. And while we're talking about, you know, politics and the presidential election, again, we forget. In 1964, there was something called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party that made demands on the convention in Atlantic City in 1964 to basically seat a legit delegation of Democrats elected from the populace, as opposed to a white segregationist slate of Democrats, because the Democratic Party was still strong in the South and was very segregationist at its heart. And so here's a woman that gets lost in the history books, but when we talk about, you know, fighting for the vote and the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act in 64 and 65, she's in that history. Ella Baker is another person, you know, in that history. There are just so many people that again, by not taking the long view, I mean, it's interesting because in teaching civil rights history now, there's much more of a focus when it's taught on using this vocabulary and talking about take the long view, and don't just do these snapshots at intervals, because you miss, right, what we've been talking about. And so all these people need their due in the history books. I mean, this also is the anniversary today of the lynching of, you know, a young African American, Emmett Till, in Mississippi. You know, earlier in the decades. In 1955, this happens, and he's basically grabbed up off the street for allegedly whistling. That's the charge against him, for allegedly whistling at a white woman on a downtown street in a small town in Mississippi. And, you know, he's killed. And later, the woman who made the accusation that he had whistled didn't whistle at all. She made it up. And even if he had whistled, so the hell what? Right? Exactly. But I was thinking about this, and it reminded me in a way of sort of now how everybody's trying to demonize Mr. Blake, right? And sort of say, well, he had it coming because maybe he had a warrant, or maybe he, you know, any way that you can vilify the person, and then you forget, well, wait, even I don't think any of that's true. I don't know what's true and what's not about his prior time to opening his car door with his kids in the car. But nothing that he did before that justifies what happened, right? I mean, and so when you start like, you know, well, you know, maybe he did this, maybe there was a knife in the car, which nobody seemed to find or prove at this point either. But even if he did, it wasn't in his hand.
Exactly. And what was he doing? So, he was trying to break up a fight. And that's what he
at
gets
the beginning, shot for. Right. He pulled over to stop something from happening with his kids in the car. Exactly. So, I mean, this whole, like, it's just, it becomes hard to try to understand the denial of the history. So even like thinking recently about all the dust-ups with the city council, like the inability to grasp why this history we've been talking about matters. And this very reflexive, which I think white people do, this very reflexive, I didn't do it. Right? I mean, quickly when somebody will say, well, America is racist or this, that, you know, however it gets phrased, I didn't do it. What's that got to do with me? I wasn't around in 1855. Nobody's saying you were, obviously. That's not the point that's being made. But if you're not willing to listen, and you're not, it's like, okay, what are we doing, right? And as an educator, again, for me, it's the same thing. Like, if you don't want to listen, if you just want to like if you think sticking your fingers in your ears means it didn't happen, yeah, it still happened.
Exactly. And all like we just said, all of these small events that are all intricately tied together, these movements do not come out of nowhere. People aren't going to say, hey, can you please just declare racism as a public health crisis just randomly, just random. We're just making it up. Like, why, you know, you're not paying attention to the history. You're not paying attention to the history of this country. You're not paying attention to the history of Lowell. We talk about it on this show all of the time. How many people have come in and been, every immigrant group has come in and been crazily discriminated against here in Lowell. Well, there in Lowell. But like, you see it over time, and and I'm sure that some of these folks have heard stories from their own grandparents of what they've had to face, and the adversity that they had to overcome. But then by second, third generation, we know how assimilation works. We know that you can remove your culture and call yourself white in America and then be afforded some privilege. We know that. We've seen it happen. We watch it happen. Black and brown folks cannot do that. It's just we see it's systematic. It uh, don't let me go off on this, but it's systematic, you know. Or I think about the 100-year anniversary of the 19th Amendment, right? But that wasn't for everybody. People always, you know, praise the suffragette movement all the time, but all women did not get the right to vote at that time. We had to wait 45 years, right? It was 45 years we had to wait until
The Voting Rights Act.
everybody. Yeah. So it's like,
and then still not everybody.
and
Right?
still
Even,
not
I mean, which is
everybody.
the other thing, right? Even after the Voting Act gets passed, it's not like somehow the waters have parted and now everybody can go vote. In certain parts of the country, it was still made much more difficult than in other parts of the country, and we're seeing the same thing happen again. I mean, when you take a big city like Atlanta and you eliminate like 90% of the polling places and force people to stand out in the hot sun in a pandemic for 7 hours to be able to vote, how do you not see that as? And again, we get into these weird arguments about, well, you should have an ID, you shouldn't. Well, even if you accept the notion that people should have an ID in the way that it gets talked about, that still doesn't deal with the fact that you've closed 90% of the polling places. So now you have everybody in line with an ID, they still can't vote. So yeah, I mean, and again, I think we forget I mean, there were lots of people in Lowell in the early 20th century, lots of women fighting for that right to vote, but there were also lots of Black women who were very much involved in the movement to get the vote, and then felt left out when it was all over, because, you know, okay, we still haven't dealt with this question of sort of resegregation after the end of Reconstruction in the 1870s, and sort of the reinstitution in a way of white supremacy in the country. And, you know, even though African Americans are not oppressed in the same way in the North as they are in the South through the early part of the 20th century, they're still discriminated against in terms of housing, jobs, and it's still very difficult to get to vote. It might not be as physically violent on a daily basis 24/7, but it's there. And it's there. I mean, you just need to look back to the early part of the summer, the Tulsa, Oklahoma riot that caused everybody to get all involved in the history of where Trump was going to have one of his convention rallies. And, you know, it's all of a piece. And somehow, again, the idea that Lowell is immune to all this, like somehow Lowell is separate from that history, which when I listen to the city council, I feel like they're saying, like, not us, like that, maybe that happened someplace else.
Right.
No.
But you can see it very clearly in the vitriol in the comments, or, you know, folks using their power to, you know, try to alienate whole businesses and things like that. And it's detestable, honestly. But, you know, I think about, you know, again, do you not know Lowell's history? So do you think that a bunch of girls overnight were just like, all right, we're mad about having to work in these mills, we're gonna go on a labor strike? Like, do you think that these labor movements that happened here in Lowell, that happened here, like in Lawrence and all these in all these other mill cities, do you think those just cropped up overnight? Like, I just really want to get an understanding of how folks think the history works. It's all connected. Those same folks who were fighting for abolition here, right? That was in Lowell. Like, we have prominent abolitionists coming out of Lowell. Also, we're saying, hey, you know what's also not fair? This right here. This is not. Lowell has its history of fighting against all kinds of tyranny. So I
Yeah.
don't understand. It's never been just like, yeah, no, everything is fine. We're fine. Like it's there's no such thing. There's no such thing.
It's in the bones. It's in the DNA of the city. It's like when you look at the mills. At least for me, when I get on my back porch and I can see across from the hill I live on, the downtown and the boot mill and sort of all of that, mass mills and whatever. That's what I mean, I'm a labor historian by training, so that's what I think of. Like, wow, I wish I could fly back and know exactly what was happening. But when you read what they've written about what it was like day to day, you can get a fairly reasonable approximation. If you have a bit of empathy, along with reading what they've written, you can begin to understand. And again, we sort of miss that the same way that we miss in the more recent period, as you were saying before, the generational sort of tussles between various immigrant groups. Why is it that Greeks really celebrate Ellen Sampras being the first Greek elected mayor? Because they saw it as a milestone in their progress in the city. I mean, that's what people do, right? You celebrate those sorts of things. And so why shouldn't anybody else? And just because of the color of your skin, that means somehow you're not seen that way, or you're not seen as having the same value, right? And we get so sidetracked. But I mean, some of it too, I mean, interesting with school starting again. I mean, some of it is the way that we have pretty much taught history, where we just teach the big events, and we teach the big event and without the backstory. And some of it is a function of time. Teachers at the elementary, middle, and high school levels are supposed to cover so much stuff in so little amount of time. Like, how do you do justice to things? But we're sort of caught in the way that we teach, and then we end up having these really strange debates in the city council and on the school committee about how racism impacts Lowell in 2020, as though somehow it doesn't, because we integrated Lowell High in 1834.
That's the history they would like to take the credit for.
Yeah, a lot of history has happened since 1834. Now, nobody's denigrating that happened. Good for Lowell for having done that. But what transpired since then? And again, even something like I know we're nearly there to the end to wrap up, but thinking about all the athletes in the last few days, particularly the women's NBA, which I think everybody sort of lionized the men, and fine, they did what they did, and then they left the women out. Headline in the Boston Globe sports page, which I actually wrote a letter to the editor of the sports page saying, dude, what the hell? NBA, stops or boycotts games. And I'm thinking, how much harder would it have been to put NBA and WNBA, or WNBA and NBA, put the WNBA, whatever. It's sort of like, we just keep doing it, right? And it was so obvious. But again, we then missed the tradition. I posted something in social media today or yesterday, I guess, of a photo that I found of Bill Russell, a basketball player in Lowell, played for the Celtics in 1963. And it talked about him demonstrating, for civil rights as a basketball player. And you think of him, you think of Muhammad Ali, the boxer. And so, again, there's a continuum, right? Athletes have done these things. It's much more dramatic now because of the time that we're in. But people want to think of it again as sort of like this weird aberration. It's not. No. Athletes are human beings, and they are now able to use their position, which I'm really grateful for, because I think they can reach a lot of young people, particularly who follow sports, in ways that an old history white teacher like me can't. And they can get to a lot of people and get them thinking, which I think is really, in the time we're in, incredibly important.
Yeah. Oh, wow, Bob. I feel like we covered so many broad topics today, but also with very and we do this. We do our kind of like a catch up for a lot of our previous episodes, and I implore people to watch our previous episodes because we talk about each of these things in length in those episodes. But Bob, one thing when we were discussing what we were going to talk about today, and I know we only have a couple minutes, but these fractures, they're like, we're so disjointed as a nation, it seems, but there is some hope. But at the same time, it seems like this is maybe the most disjointed we've been, the most fractured that we've been in a while. Would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been interesting for me to think about the summer, because even though the pandemic is on and everything else that's happening, as well as sort of the political scene in the country is really disjointed and difficult for lots of people to relate to. I feel with all the fracture, I feel optimistic, because I think of, for example, the rally a few weeks ago in Lowell in the plaza before that city council meeting, and all those Lowell High young people who got up and talked about what had happened to them and what they wanted and how they wanted a better Lowell and a better high school and how they wanted to fight for a quality education and for being treated equally in the city. And that's really heartening, that in spite of or despite all the other crap that adults have foisted on them, there's still that in there, in them. And so I personally went away from that event feeling much better than I probably would have felt otherwise. And so I do think there's cause for optimism. I fear for the current political sort of campaign in the next two and a half months, because I just think the vitriol is going to be really, really hard to take. And I just worry about there being more gun violence like there was in Kenosha with, you know, a young white person coming to a rally and shooting people. And I'm just fearful of all of that because of the climate that's been ginned up by the president right now. I mean, it is him, so we might as well say it. And you know, the notion of there's good people on both sides, that kind of metaphor sort of justifies some of what happened the other night with somebody killing people. And I obviously I don't want that to happen. I'm fearful that it will. But I think political discourse has to improve. I don't know how we fix that, because I feel like, you know, we could do another show just on the broken political system. I feel like the political system and the process to elect a president is broken.
Yeah.
And that in 2020, the two candidates are in their mid-70s is simply insane. Just it makes no sense. That we and you know, I'm one of those people in that age bracket, right? I'm not quite in the middle yet, but I'm closing in on it. And it just seems wrong that the alleged grown-ups haven't figured out yet. It's time for them to go away.
Yeah.
And let other people try to figure this out. I mean, I feel like my generation has handed the generations coming behind me a bucket of swill. And you know, in all honesty, I think the economy, the environment, all these things we've talked about, and it pains me I tell my students this all the time, I apologize, but we push forward. I think, Maritza, your optimism and determination also gives me heart.
Well, Bob, it's definitely a mutual feeling, because after these, I always feel like, okay, the change can happen. It just takes a small group of determined people. And I think you and I think it's an affirmation loop that'll happen for sure. But yes, thank you, Bob. Thank you so much. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been History in Lowell with us.